Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to our section 3.2 reading of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Glad to be continuing this reading with y'all today. As always, if you're new, you can find the text in the pinned section of this Discord. And without further ado, let's get started with Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Section 3.2. Section 3.2 is titled Africa's Contribution to the Economy and Beliefs of Early Capitalist Europe. The kind of benefits which Europe derived from its control of commerce are fairly well known. Although it is curious that the recognition of Africa's major contribution to European development is usually made in works devoted specifically to that subject. While European scholars of Europe often treat the European economy as if it were entirely independent. European economies of the 19th century had no illusions about the interconnections between their national economies and the world at large. J.S. Mill, as spokesman for British capitalism, said that as far as England was concerned, the trade of the West Indies is hardly to be considered as external trade, but more resembles the traffic between town and country. By the phrase trade of the West Indies, Mill meant the commerce between Africa, England, and the West Indies, because without African labor, the West Indies were valueless. Karl Marx also commented on the way that European capitalists tied Africa, the West Indies, and Latin America into the capitalist system. And being the most bitter critic of capitalism, Marx went on to point out that what was good for Europeans was obtained at the expense of untold suffering by Africans and American Indians. Marx noted that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the turning of Africa into a commercial warren for the hunting of black skin signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Some attempts have been made to try and quantify the actual monetary profits made by Europeans from engaging in the slave trade. The actual dimensions are not easy to fix, but the profits were fabulous. John Hawkins made 3 trips to West Africa in the 1560s and stole Africans whom he sold to the Spanish in America. On returning to England after the first trip, his profit was so handsome that Queen Elizabeth I became interested in directly participating in his next venture, and she provided for that purpose a ship named the Jesus. Hawkins left with the Jesus to steal some more Africans, and he returned to England with such dividends that Queen Elizabeth made him a knight. Hawkins chose as his coat of arms the representation of an African in chains. Of course, there were inevitably voyages that failed, slave ships that were lost at sea, etc. Sometimes trade in Africa did well, while at other times it was the profit in the Americas that was really substantial. When all the ups and downs are ironed out, the level of profit had to be enough to justify continued participation in that particular form of trade for centuries. A few bourgeois scholars have tried to suggest that the trade in slaves did not have worthwhile monetary returns. They would have us believe that the same entrepreneurs whom they praise in other contexts as the heroes of capitalist development were so dumb with regard to slavery and slave trade that for centuries they absorbed themselves in a non-profit venture. Man, talk about a ridiculous idea. Jesus Christ, that's awful. This kind of argument is worth noting more as an example of the distortions of which white bourgeois scholarship is capable than as something requiring serious consideration. Besides, quite apart from capital accumulation, Europe's trade with Africa gave numerous stimuli to Europe's growth. Central and South America gold and silver, mined by Africans, played a crucial role in meeting the need for coin in the expanding capitalist economy. Western Europe, while African gold was also significant in that respect. African gold helped the Portuguese to finance further navigations around the Cape of Good Hope and into Asia ever since the 15th century. African gold was also the main source for the mintage of Dutch gold coin in the 17th century, helping Amsterdam to become the finance capital of Europe in that period. And further, it was no coincidence that when the English struck a new gold coin in 1663, they called it the New Guinea, or the Guinea, sorry. The Encyclopedia Britannica explains that the guinea was a gold coin at one time current in the United Kingdom. It was first coined in 1663 in the reign of Charles II, from gold imported from the Guinea coast of West Africa by a company of merchants trading under charter from the British Crown, hence the name. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and for most of the 19th century, the exploitation of Africa and African labor continued to be a source for the accumulation of capital to be reinvested in Western Europe. The African contribution to European capitalist growth extended over such vital sectors as shipping, insurance, the formation companies, capitalist agriculture, technology, and the manufacture of machinery. The effects were so wide-ranging that many are seldom brought to the notice of the reading public. For instance, the French street malo fishing industry was revived by the opening of markets in the French slave plantation, while the Portuguese in Europe depended heavily on dyes like indigo, camwood, Brazil wood, and cochineal brought from Africa and the Americas. Gum from Africa also played a part in the textile industry, which is acknowledged as having been one of the most powerful engines of growth within the European economy. Then there was the export of ivory from Africa, enriching many merchants in London's minting lane, and providing the raw material for industries in England, France, Germany, Switzerland, and North America, producing items ranging from knife handles, piano keys. Wow, I ain't never known nothing about that. That's wild. Africa's been drawn into the orbit of Western Europe's sped up the latter's technological development. For example, the evolution of European shipbuilding from the 16th century to the 19th century was a logical consequence of their monopoly of sea commerce in that period. During that time, the North Africans were bottled up in the Mediterranean, and although it was from them that Europeans initially borrowed a great deal of nautical instrumentation, North Africans made no further worthwhile advances. Where the original European advantage was not sufficient to assure supremacy, they deliberately undermined other people's efforts. The Indian Navy, for instance, suffered from the rigid enforcement of the English navigation laws. Yet the expenses involved in building new and better European ships were met from the profits of overseas trade with India, Africa, etc. The Dutch were pioneers in improving upon the which took the Spanish and Portuguese out across the Atlantic, and a succession of Dutch trading companies operating in Asia, Africa, and America were the ones responsible for experimentation. By the 18th centuries, the British were using Dutch know-how as a basis for surpassing the Dutch themselves, and the Atlantic was their laboratory. It used to be said that the slave trade was a training ground for British seamen. It is probably more significant to note that the Atlantic trade was the stimulator of consistent advances in naval technology. So Zoe asks, do the scholars who try to make the argument that the slave trade wasn't profitable not realize they're saying the slave traders were doing it just because they were evil people? Yeah, like they're making necessarily a moralistic argument about why these people were engaged in slavery, and rather than trying to admit to the fact that slavery was just totally in the interest of capitalistic entities, basically from time immemorial. The idea that these people act out of not because they're just totally evil and not because out of actual self-interest is, well, that's a worldview I suppose liberals might have you believe, but they probably wouldn't even go on to suggest something as ridiculous as, oh, it was just totally about how evil they were. Profit had nothing to do with it. It wasn't even that profitable because it's the liberals who will actually argue that slavery was quite profitable. Hell, they'll argue to this day that exploitation of the global south is profitable, and that's why it's justified to continue to do it. Like, this is the profit motive that's exactly what the profit motive does to people. It will quite literally have you saying that human suffering is a worthwhile cause, for a quick buck. Yeah, ahistorical is the nice way to say it for sure. I have to be kind. We just got back. You already know though. So the most spectacular feature in Europe, which was connected with African trade, was the rise of seaport towns, notably Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Bordeaux, and Seville. Directly or indirectly connected to those ports, there often emerged the manufacturing centers which gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. In England, it was the county of Lancashire, which was the first center of the Industrial Revolution, and the economic advance in Lancashire depended first on the growth of the port of Liverpool through slave trading. The connections between slavery and capitalism and the growth of England is adequately documented by Eric Williams in his well-known book, Slavery, Capitalism and Slavery. Williams gives a clear picture of the numerous benefits which England derived from trading and exploiting slaves. And he identified by name several of the personalities in capitalist firms who were the beneficiaries. Outstanding examples are provided in the persons of David and Alexander Barclay, who were engaging in slave trade in 1756, and who later used the loot to set up Barclays Bank. There was a similar progression in the case of Lloyd's, from being a small London coffee house to being one of the world's largest banking and insurance houses after dipping into profits from slave trade and slavery. Then there was James Watt, expressing eternal gratitude to the West Indian slave owners who directly financed his famous steam engine and took it from the drawing board to the factory. A similar picture would emerge from any detailed study of French capitalism and slavery, given the fact that during the 18th century, the West Indies accounted for 20% of France's external trade, much more than the whole of Africa in the present century. Of course, benefits were not always directly proportionate to the amount of involvement of a given European state in the Atlantic trade. The enormous profits of Portuguese overseas enterprise passed rapidly out of the Portuguese economy into the hands of the more developed Western European capitalist nations who supplied Portugal with capital, ships, and trade goods. Germany was included in this category along with England, Holland, and France. Sadhu says, "It was so great to see those people topple that slave trader statue and toss it into the sea in Bristol last year." Hell yeah, that shit had to be inspiring as fuck, I imagine. Commerce deriving from Africa helped a great deal to strengthen transnational links within the Western European economy, bearing in mind that American produce was the consequence of African labor. Brazilian dyewoods, for example, were re-exported from Portugal into the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the Baltic, and passed into the continental cloth industry of the 17th century. Sugar from the Caribbean was re-exported from England and France to other parts of Europe to such an extent that Hamburg in Germany was the biggest sugar refining center in Europe in the first half of the 18th century. Germany supplied manufacturers to Scandinavia, Holland, England, France, and Portugal for resale in Africa. England, France, and Holland found it necessary to exchange various classes of goods to better the deal with Africans for gold, slaves, and ivory. The financiers and merchants of Genoa were the powers behind the markets of Lisbon and Seville, while Dutch bankers played a similar role with respect to Scandinavia and England. Western Europe was that part of Europe in which by the 15th century the trend was most visible that feudalism was giving way to capitalism. In Eastern Europe, feudalism was still strong in the 19th century. Absolutely. So the peasants were being driven off the land in England, and agriculture was becoming a capitalist operation. It was also becoming technologically more advanced, producing food and fibers to support a larger population and to provide a more effective basis for the woolen and linen industries in particular. The technological base of industry, as well as its social and economic organization, was being transformed. African trade speeded up several aspects, including the integration of Western Europe, as noted above. That is why the African connection contributed not merely to economic growth, which relates to quantitative dimensions, but also to real development in the sense of increased capacity for further growth and independence. The European slave trade, mention must be made of the USA, not only because its dominant population was European, but also because Europe transferred its capitalist institution more completely to North America than to any other part of the globe and established a powerful form of capitalism. After eliminating the indigenous inhabitants and exploiting the labor of millions of Africans, like other parts of the New World, the American colonies of the British Crown were used as means of accumulating primary capital for re-export to Europe. But the northern colonies had also had direct access to benefits from slavery in the American South and in the British and French West Indies. As in Europe, the profits made from slavery and slave trade went firstly to commercial ports and industrial areas, which mainly the northeastern seaboard district known as New England and the state of New York. The Pan-Africanist Webb Du Bois and a stand of the American slave trade quoted a report of 1862 as follows. The number of persons engaged in the slave trade and the amount of capital embarked in it exceed our powers of calculation. The city of New York has been, until late 1862, the principal port of this world for this infamous commerce. Although the cities of Portland and Boston be only second to her in that distribution. American economic development up to mid-19th century rested squarely on foreign commerce, of which slavery was a pivot. In the 1830s, slave-grown cotton accounted for about half the value of all exports from the United States of America. Wow. Slave-grown cotton accounted for about half the value of all exports from the USA. That's crazy as hell. I didn't know that either. But furthermore, in the case of the American colonies of the 18th century, it can be observed that Africa contributed in a variety of ways, one thing leading to another. For instance, in New England, trade with Africa, Europe, and the West Indies and slaves and slave-grown products supplied cargo for their merchant marine, stimulated the growth of their shipbuilding industry, built up their towns and their cities, and enabled them to utilize their forests, fisheries, and soil more effectively. Finally, it was the carrying trade between the West Indian slave colonies in Europe which lay behind the emancipation of the American colonies from British rule. And it was no accident that the struggle for American independence started in the leading New England town of Boston. In the 19th century, the connection with Africa continued to play an indirect role in American political growth. In the first place, profits from the slave activities went into the coffers of political parties. And even more important, the African stimulation and black labor played a vital role in extending European control over the present territory of the USA, notably in the South, but including also the so-called Wild West, where black cowboys were active. Not something you hear about every day. Slavery is useful for early accumulation of capital, but it is too rigid for industrial development. Okay, that makes sense. The idea that you can use slavery to make a quick profit, but you can't necessarily develop industry on the institution of slavery, which might then necessarily play into the logic of why the U.S. was eventually willing to rid itself of slavery in the first place. The idea that there's totally moralistic reasons for something like the Emancipation Proclamation is absolute nonsense. The capitalists did their calculus, y'all, and determined that industry had to be developed and that slavery was not an efficient enough institution to develop industry. This is literally the logic that plays out in these people's heads. Slaves had to be given crude, non-breakable tools which held back the capitalist development of agriculture and industry. That explains that the northern portions of the USA gained far more industrial benefits from slavery than the South, which actually had slave institutions on its soil. And ultimately, the states was reached during the American Civil War, when the northern capitalists fought to end slavery within the boundaries of the USA, so that the country as a whole could advance to a higher level of capitalism. In effect, one could say that within the USA, the slave relations in the South had by the second half of the 19th century come into conflict with the further expansion of the productive base inside the USA as a whole. And a violent clash ensued before the capitalist relations of legally free labor became generalized. Europe maintained slavery in places that were physically remote from European society, and therefore inside Europe itself, capitalist relations were elaborated without being adversely affected by slavery in the Americas. However, in Europe, there came a moment when the leading capitalist states found that the trade in slaves and the use of slave labor in the Americas was no longer in the interest of their further development. Britain made this decision early in the 19th century, to be followed later by France. So there's a lot to talk about in the first section that we just finished reading, y'all. And as always, you can remember, y'all can remember if you want to say something in the voice chat, just type stack in the chat and I'll call on y'all to be able to say what it is you want to say. But so we've been discussing it, but like it's worth repeating this idea that the capitalist class has tried to run with the horseshit idea that slavery wasn't even a profitable institution, as if the institution didn't go on for hundreds of years. When we know, just even living in modern times, if a new business, a new corporation, any new institution whose purpose is the profit motive only has a couple of years at best to turn a profit. You know, those the speed at which these companies will fold, the speed at which these corporations will go under and downsize in order to turn a quick profit if it isn't happening through whatever business model they were employing can't be understated. So the idea that the capitalist class would ever, for a couple hundred years, let a so-called unprofitable institution just continue to run inefficiently and without profit, that's absolutely not the case. And I mean, Rodney's getting into it directly here. He talks about how cotton produced in slavery was made up about half of all exports out of the United States. So are we to believe that such a discrepancy in exports wasn't a profitable thing for the capitalists? That's absolutely bullshit. Zoe says one of the reasons for the desire to abolish slavery in the U.S. was the fear of a widespread slave rebellion. Absolutely, because the fear of a widespread slave rebellion is, again, not even these people approaching it from a moralistic standpoint. They're literally saying, "Oh fuck, these people are like going to come together in their own class interest to overthrow us, who are much smaller in number and who have been actively working against the interests of these slaves." The slaves and have been rebelling simply for the moral reason of wanting to get out from slavery, which obviously would be a fucking factor. It would also be that quite literally their labor had been exploited for centuries, and that they were quite literally, for the entire duration of that time, sick of being exploited and never actually benefiting from the value of their labor. Like, that's logic of slavery played out blatantly. Now, what you end up seeing, is people have to have their class interests represented in order for them to be content enough to not engage in revolution and rebellion. And obviously, being content is the furthest thing that you would associate with the institution of slavery. So, capitalist exploitation is necessarily on grotesque display when the institution of slavery is implemented, because it is the logic of capitalism playing out, in the most blatant, unsubtle, just destructive and disgusting way possible. And so, again, the capitalists, as we always say here in bread theory, did the fucking math and they understood this to be the truth. So that's a strong point you made there, Zoe. Sadhu said, "Yeah, I was just going to say, they must have been scared after Haiti." Yeah, they literally continue to exploit Haiti to a devastating degree to this day, just to make an example of her, that rising up in your class interest against capitalists is just a no-go. Like, they haven't continued to exploit Haiti because they're evil and keep Haiti down because they're, they are evil, but evil doesn't factor into the calculus. It's literally in their minds and in the logic of capitalists to say, hey, this country rose up and has success. We can't have that repeating itself. Let's make an example out of them so that nobody around them gets the same damn idea. That's just how it works in these people's heads. Exactly, Sudden. Can't have good examples. That's unacceptable to the capitalist class. Saber, would you mind taking over the reading for a little bit, Big Dog? Same reason they invaded Grenada, a country of 100,000 people. Exactly. No, if you have one domino falling anywhere, well, we know how it works. They start to fall everywhere. And, the idea of slaves revolting successfully against the capitalist class, that's an abhorrent idea to the capitalist class. And they will spare no expense to put down any examples of capitalism playing out.
All right, I can start reading for a bit. Since capitalism, like any other mode of production, is a total system which involves an ideological aspect, it's also necessary to focus on the effects of the ties with Africa on the development of ideas within the superstructure of European capitalist society. In that sphere, the most striking feature is undoubtedly the rise of racism as a widespread and deeply rooted element in European thought. The role of slavery in promoting racist prejudice and ideology has been carefully studied in certain situations, especially in the United States of America. The simple fact is that no people can enslave another for centuries without coming out with a notion of superiority. And when the color and other physical traits of those people were quite different, it was inevitable that the prejudice would take the form of racism. Within Africa itself, the same can be said for the situation in the Cape province of South Africa, where white men were establishing military and social superiority over non-whites ever since 1650. Sorry. It would be much too sweeping a statement to say that all racial and color prejudice in Europe derived from the enslavement of Africans and the exploitation of non-white peoples in the early centuries of international trade. There was also anti-Semitism at an even earlier date inside Europe, and there is always an element of suspicion and incomprehension when peoples of different cultures come together. However, it can be affirmed without reservations that the white racism which came to pervade the world was an integral part of the capitalist mode of production. Nor was it merely a question of how the individual white person treated a black person. The racism of Europe was a set of generalizations and assumptions with no scientific basis, but were rationalized in every sphere, from theology to biology. Occasionally, it is mistakenly held that Europeans enslaved Africans for racist reasons. European planters and miners enslaved Africans for economic reasons, so that their labor power could be exploited. Indeed, it would have been impossible to open up the New World and use it as a constant generator of wealth had it not been for African labor. There was no alternatives. The American Indian population was virtually wiped out, and Europe's population was too small for settlement overseas at the time. Then, having become utterly dependent on African labor, Europeans at home and abroad found it necessary to rationalize their exploitation in racist terms as well. Oppression follows logically from exploitation so as to guarantee the latter. Oppression of African people on purely racial grounds accompanied, strengthened, and became indistinguishable from oppression for economic reasons. C.L.R. James noted, Pan-Africanists and Marxists once remarked that the race question is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. But to neglect the racial factor as merely incidental is an error only less grave than to make it fundamental. It can be argued that by the 19th century, white racism had become so institutionalized in the capitalist world, and notably in the USA, that it sometimes ranked above the maximalization of profit as a motive for oppressing black people. In the short run, European racism seemed to have done Europeans no harm, and they used those erroneous ideas to justify further domination of non-European people in the colonial epoch. But the international proliferation of bigoted and unscientific racist ideas was bound to have its negative consequences in the long run. When Europeans put millions of their brothers, Jews, into ovens under the Nazis, the chickens were coming home to roost. Such behavior inside of quote-unquote democratic Europe was not as strange as it is sometimes made out to be. There was always a contradiction between the elaboration of democratic ideas inside Europe and the elaboration of authoritarian and thuggish practices by Europeans with respect to Africans. When the French Revolution was made in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it did not extend to Black Africans who were enslaved by France in the West Indies and the Indian Ocean. Indeed, France fought against the efforts of those people to emancipate themselves, and the leaders of their bourgeois revolution said plainly that they did not make it on behalf of Black humanity. It is not even true to say that capitalism developed democracy at home in Europe and not abroad. At home, it was responsible for a talk of certain rhetoric of freedom, but it was never extended from the bourgeoisie to the oppressed workers, and the treatment of Africans must surely have made such a hypocrisy a habit of European life, especially within the ruling class. How else can one explain the fact that the Christian church participated fully in the maintenance of slavery and still talks about saving souls? The hypocrisy reached its highest levels inside the USA, The first martyr in the American National War of Liberation against the British colonialists in the 18th century was an African descendant, Crispus Attucks, and both slave and free Africans played a key role in Washington's armies. And yet the American Constitution, with its famous preamble that, quote, all men are created equal, unquote, sanctioned and continued enslavement of Africans. In recent times, it has become an object of concern to some liberals that the USA is capable of war crimes of the order of My Lai in Vietnam. But the fact of the matter is that the My Lai began with the enslavement of Africans and American Indians. Racism, violence, and brutality were the committants of the capitalist system when it extended itself abroad in the early centuries of international trade. A brief guide to reading. The subject of Africa's contribution to European development reveals several of the factors which limit a writer's representation of reality. Language and nationality, for instance, are effective barriers to communication. Works in English seldom take account of the effects brought about in France, Holland, or Portugal by participation in slaving and other forms of commerce which exploited Africa in the pre-colonial period. The ideological gulf is responsible for the fact that most bourgeois scholars write about phenomenon such as the Industrial Revolution in England without once mentioning the European slave trade as a factor in primary accumulation of capital. Marx himself had laid great emphasis on sources of overseas capital accumulation, but Marxists as prominent as Maurice Dubb and E.J. Hobsbawm for many years concentrated on examining the evolution of capitalism out of feudalism in Europe, with only marginal reference to the massive exploitation of Africans, Asians, and American Indians. Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, Oliver Cox, Capitalism as a System. Cox, as an African American, makes the basic point that capitalism has from the very early times been an international system. Eric Williams, a West Indian, was very precise and very detailed in illustrating connection between British capitalism and the enslavement of Africans. W.E.B. Du Bois, the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade to the USA. Richard Pears, Yankees and Creoles, the trade between North America. Both of these provide data on the contribution of African labor to the development of capitalism in the USA in the epoch of slavery. Leo Huberman, Man's Worldly Goods, The Story of the Wealth of Nations. F. Claremonti, Economic Liberalism and Underdevelopment. Huberman's book is an excellent overall treatment of the development of capitalism out of feudalism in Europe. It includes a section in which the role of slavery is highlighted. Claremonti's study accords recognition to the role played by the subcontinent of India in building Europe. P. Curtin, The Image of Africa, Winthrop Jordan, White Over Black, Americans' Attitudes Towards the Negro. These two texts are relevant to the question of the rise of white racism, although neither of the two make sufficiently explicit connection between racism and capitalism.
Yeah, 3.2 wasn't that long. Did you want to share your thoughts on what you were reading there, Saber?
Yeah, I guess it just shows the connection between the ideas of racism and, well, I guess the contradiction between the ideas of like freedom and liberty and all that kind of stuff, whereas all of them were either oppressing Africans and indigenous Turtle Islanders, I guess, and as well as the working class in their own nations as well. And also shows the I don't know, just this sort of unusual nature that like speak about all these things and just without just ever considering that like there's a contradiction there, primarily because of the dehumanization that went on, stuff like that. And you can kind of draw some parallels today, even though it's not as overt. Seems to have transitioned more into something structural in the sense that, yeah, like most people would see these sort of, when most people talk about racism in today's society, they'll just point to like Nazis or whatever and say, oh, look, either it's not as bad as it was before, or like, look, it's still pretty bad because of these individual acts, but those are just I guess, fruiting bodies, to give an analogy to mushrooms and mycelium, the fruiting bodies being the overt racism and stuff like that, and then the covert structural would be the sort of mycelium that runs through the soil and the ground and stuff like that, which still pervades and will still continue to reproduce those overt acts of racism given the correct conditions and stuff. So I guess those are my thoughts.
That's a good point. So, because here's the thing, and this is what white folks always get wrong when they talk about racism, and then when they do as you said, and they talk about, oh, things have gotten better even if they're not perfect. Here's the thing. That can only be the case if you assume racism was the nice, dressed up dictionary definition of, oh, racism is when you hate people for the color of their skin. And since there's a lot less of that's prevalent, racism must have gotten better. Because that's an easy line to draw. But what is practically the case, and what the case Black people have been making the whole time, is that the logic that led to the institution in the first place is still firmly at hand. The logic that leads to capitalism, or the logic that leads to enslaving people, the logic that leads to the marginalization of the global South, the logic that leads to the exploitation is totally still at hand. So you still have not just a profit motive, but you have people who are constantly trying to figure out how they can get the most labor out of the most people, for the least amount of material give back that they possibly can. And so we see this playing out in the prison system this day, which, by the way, is legalized slavery. They keep trying to say they abolished slavery, but all they did was rename slavery prison labor. But it's still at play. You got firefighters in California only making $1 an hour. Some people getting paid the equivalent of about 14 cents for a week's worth of work. Shit along those lines. The logic is still firmly at play. They still very much target people. What is functionally the difference between a slave catcher and a cop who locks you up for something like weed, knowing that when they do lock you up, you're going to be subjected to forced and conscripted labor, for very little to no pay at all. That's not functionally different at all. So when people try to say things have gotten better, they are quite literally ignoring the material conditions that led to the problem in the first place. Does that make sense? And so it's the logic itself has to be destroyed in order for things to have actually gotten better. And the only way to do that is working class revolution. Literally, the logic's not going to go away just because some people hate people less for the color of their skin. What? That doesn't have anything to do. That was almost a front of a reason. Now, is that to say that there aren't people whose whole thing is about the skin color and the racial characteristics, as our friend Jet would say and shit? Of course, there are people like that. But the institution itself, I won't say it couldn't care less about that, but that's not at the forefront of its mind. The whole thing is what could they benefit from it? When the capitalists made the calculation that they could benefit more from the abolishment of the institution of chattel slavery, that's when they did it. And as soon as they decide it's more profitable to be humane towards the imprisoned, marginalized folks, that's when they'll do it. But right now, it's so profitable to just keep things going the way they are. So that's how it's going to go. The profit motive can never be underestimated as a motivator for the capitalist class, because this is literally the logic that's playing into why everything works the way it does. So yeah, you're totally correct on what you were saying there, Saber. So Zoe says, to learn more about the ideologies of slavery and fascism in Europe and how they grow naturally from classical liberalism, see Domenico Lacerdo's Liberalism, A Counter History. We're going to get that. We're going to get a PDF of that put in the chat since Zoe referenced that so that anybody can reference it. Sadhu says, I always like to share this quote. Yes, it will be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he's being inconsistent, and that at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such, And it's a crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. Aims to say their discourse on colonialism. Like, that's real shit. What Hitler laid to bear was the concept that Europeans living in Europe are not at all immune from the logic of colonialism, and one day finding themselves at the mercy, of colonizers who look just like them. There's this unspoken deal between European countries, and in some cases, not unspoken at all, actually quite spoken, that colonization is not meant to actually happen across Europe. It's meant to happen across the global south, and to avoid the ugliest part of the logic of capitalism, which says that necessarily the infinite growth model means that these European countries are going to have to one day come to try to dominate the other European countries. They're going to ignore that and agree to band together to just simply do it to the global south and leave their own countries out of it. That's why it's horseshit, the idea that like the Scandinavian countries are like not capitalistic, not imperialistic, not colonialist. Like literally they're bought off. They've made a deal to keep themselves from being eroded by the worst excesses of capitalism and colonialism. So this idea, like what Césaire is talking about here, it's spot on. It's spot on. And word and the logic 10 described as the absolute bedrock of capitalism. Thank you, comrade. Sadhu says, I highly recommend that full text, by the way, but the Discourse on Colonialism text, which we'll get a PDF in here for that as well. It's pretty short, but it really dissects the hypocrisy of the liberal mindset. The British literally replaced the slaves with indentured laborers from India. Zoe says, oh, okay, so Sadhu put the Discourse on Colonialism PDF there, so I'll pin that real quick. And then, yeah, but we have to always understand that colonialism has its own logic, right? Capitalism has its own logic. And the infinite profit motive, the logic of infinite growth, the desire to grow infinitely necessarily plays itself out in materialistic way. These are not just conceptualizations. There's a real material basis for what this logic leads to. And it's institutions like slavery. It's institutions like the carceral police state. It's institutions like the State Department. These things don't necessarily bear out from anything other than building an apparatus whose entire motive is the infinite profit motive. And they will do anything, in the name of profit. They'll enslave people and then they'll free slaves. They'll arrest you 1 minute for a crime, and then the next minute, once they realize that thing that you did a crime for can be made profitable, they can do that. They'll make it legal for you to do that. I mean, how many people of the liberal mindset whose entire argument about marijuana legalization is literally about what profit it can generate for the states, not about the damages done. I'm talking about the incarceration to Black and brown communities, not about the health benefits, which some might bring it up, but it's never their primary argument. It's literally about, oh, look at the profit to be generated, and they'll point to Colorado generated like hundreds of millions of dollars, and now in Colorado it's $1 billion, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, as anybody could predict. But that's what these people care about. If marijuana legalization wasn't profitable, you would have more liberals arguing against the profit or against the legalization of marijuana. Hell, you still got liberals to this day. There's liberals out here right now who don't believe in the legalization of marijuana, and their entire logic is simply that, oh, if you legalize marijuana, you're gonna have people being like who engage in it and like choose not to work. You're gonna have people who choose to just like be unproductive. Like that's a lot of people. That's people's logic for not wanting to legalize it in some cases, and even that logic plays itself out in the interest of capital, because their whole thing is, well, you need to go like to work and work for your capitalist boss and like make some money, and if you're smoking weed too fucking much, then you're not gonna do that. Like that's what's going on in these fucking liberal brains. So like nothing's divorced from the logic of capitalism, nothing's divorced from the logic of colonialism. It's an entire apparatus that all feeds into itself and works together. These are not separate institutions that just so happen to collaborate. it's all one institution. And so even liberal ideas about what society ought to look like end up necessarily working along the line of that logic. And, we have to keep that in mind. So Rodney does a fantastic job of laying that out here today. So Cincy was still typing, so I'll see what they have to say, and then I think we're going to wrap up shortly. Yeah, we'll resume with the beginning of chapter 4 next week. I didn't get to take a look at section 3.2 here, but it was a hell of a lot shorter than what most of the sections and chapters of the book are. So yeah, I'm pleased to have finished chapter 3 with y'all. Let's see what Cincy had to say. That was a mistake, sorry. Oh, okay, no problem. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up, comrades. I love y'all. Thank y'all for being here. We're gonna get that recording up on YouTube in the next few days. Also, Saber and I are gonna be re-recording a short stretch from the last, I think, the end of chapter 2, and then we're gonna get that on YouTube as well. So we're a little behind, but we're gonna be caught up by the end of the week on all of the Walter Rodneys. We're going to have to discuss what we're going to do with Parenti because we're slightly behind on getting those uploaded as well. But, the mods will work that out for y'all. But anyways, it's real good to resume with y'all. Happy to be back reading. We'll resume next Tuesday at noon for Chapter 4 of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Solidarity always, comrades. I love y'all. Y'all take care.